I've been thinking a lot about project management and people management and risk management, right? This is the kind of stuff that I think about. And one of the things when I was putting this presentation together is I thought, you know, it'd be interesting to get a little bit of a historical perspective on project management. So when I did a little research, it turns out that the first, possibly the first, project manager was a guy named, and I'm probably going to screw up his name, Imhotep. And he was in Egypt. He was an architect trying to build pyramids. And I suspect that working for the pharaohs was just not an easy thing to do. He had a tremendous number of schedules. Of course, he had access to lots of different people, whether they wanted to be on the project or not, which is not something I hope we do now. But with all those schedules, he had, I suspect, a number of problems. One of the problems when you try and meet schedules these days is that we call them deadlines. Now, the interesting thing about a deadline is that it didn't actually arise from project management. That term came around in the Civil War sometime when there was this notion of prisoners and I guess a little bit of honor, where they said, okay, you have, 14 to 17 feet around the outside of the jail. You pass that 17-foot mark, and you're a dead person. We will shoot to kill. But what we use for deadlines now is this notion of milestones. And I keep thinking, this is kind of nuts, because the more software projects we do, the more kinds of things we do, whether you're marrying software or hardware or you're just doing software, is that we're inventing stuff. We're solving problems. Our chances are very good we have not done anything like this before. And if anyone else has, we don't know about it. So just by the nature of software, because it's ephemeral, because it's digital, because there are no artifacts from the product until you get the product going, our software projects are different than any of the other historical kinds of projects that we've been doing. And so we have trouble with our software projects, not because we're idiots, not because it's an impossible thing, but because it's so different. When you're dealing with an ephemeral product where it only exists in ones and zeros, you have to deal with the project differently. And so over time, we've certainly had this notion that process will fix everything, and that if we could find the one true way to deal with the process, that we would be happy campers. We would have successful projects. Everything would work just fine. Everything would be beautiful. The sun would always shine. It would be a gorgeous day, right? And you and I both know that that's just not going to happen. It would be lovely if there was one true way. It would be lovely if process fixed everything. But that certainly has not been the case for me, and I suspect it has not been the case for you. So one of the things that I think about, right, our little agenda for this webinar is that we're going to talk a little bit about life cycles, a little bit about planning to replan, thinking about prototyping where it's necessary, thinking about implementing by feature before selecting an architecture, and this notion of never multitasking. So I hope you stick around because I want to explain those things in great detail, or at least in more detail. So when I talk about choosing a life cycle that works, a lot of us, and certainly a lot of our managers, are very comfortable with a serial life cycle. And in a serial life cycle, you're supposed to do requirements, and then you're supposed to do analysis. And way back in the day, I suspect that I have a lot more gray hair than you folks do, we actually were supposed to re-estimate the project after we finished a phase, right? So we'd finished the requirements phase. We now knew more about the project. We re-estimated the rest of the project. We finished the analysis phase. We had an architecture. We re-estimated the rest of the project. We finished design. We had all of our top-level and maybe some of our low-level designs. We re-estimated till the end of the project. And if you've ever seen this scope of the cone of uncertainty, where you're supposed to be plus or minus 400% at the beginning of the project and maybe plus or minus 200% at the beginning of coding. Well, it's never been minus, but it's frequently been plus. That's where that comes from, this notion of re-estimating at the end of each phase. Well, I'm trying to remember the last time any senior manager gave the project team enough time to re-estimate at the end of each phase. In fact, there's this notion of concurrent engineering which says if we can do requirements and start analysis when we know some of the requirements, and we don't have to call the requirements phase done until possibly sometime in design. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not a serial life cycle. It's not a true waterfall. And is that a problem? Well, it's only a problem when you see different kinds of serial life cycles. So you and I are probably very familiar with this, where you decide how much time you're going to spend on requirements, and you do that. You spend time on analysis and design and code and integration. And then you spend time on testing, because what happens in testing is there are these invisible arrows that go back to requirements, that go back to analysis, that go back to design, that go back to code, that go back to integration. Because it isn't until you get to testing where you're starting to test feature by feature that you say, oh boy, we missed something there. Now, I've also met a bunch of other serial life cycles, and the first one on this slide is the fact that requirements takes forever. And so you can try and get some requirements before you start, but you're not done. So you do your analysis, you do your design, you probably do a substantial amount of your code, if not all of your code, and then requirements are finally done. You get to integration and you get to testing, because you've been modifying things as you go, because you guys aren't stupid. You know how to make something like this work. The problem is when this life cycle turns into the one on the bottom of the slide, and you see that TEST that's shortened, right? So you still have the same 6 or 9 or 12 months or whatever it is you had for the project, but because requirements took so long, you have no time for testing. And so when you have no time for testing, you cut the test short. Well, what happens when you cut the test short? Well, you have a lot of technical debt. Maybe you can't even release. Maybe you go into tremendous amounts of overtime. There's all kinds of things that happen. All of these serial life cycles are like this because they think if I could just get the requirements straight before we start working. Well, I got to tell you, I have never met a project where change didn't happen. Right? So if change does happen, and it's only one thing, maybe your serial life cycle can handle it. But what I see much more often is a ton of change, where the change happens and happens and happens and happens, and it's so hard to absorb it. Now, I have certainly been lucky, right? I have felt like that salmon avoiding the bear. And I have been lucky, and we have managed to absorb a bunch of change, and life is not bad. But more often, you don't avoid the bear. And you feel like you're getting swallowed.